Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cristina Mislan. She's an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina.
Hello, Sonali.
Jewish Israeli settlers set fire to 2 Palestinian homes in the West Bank this morning, killing a toddler and injuring 4 others. The baby was 18-month-old Ali Saad Dawabsha. The arsonists spray painted the Star of David on the walls of the burned homes and scrawled the word revenge. According to the Washington Post, the arson assault was quickly labeled a price tag attack in the Israeli media, a phrase used to describe violence and vandalism carried out by settlers and their supporters to extract a price for any actions against them, either by the Israeli government or Palestinians. Both Palestinian and Israeli officials agreed that the attack was an act of terrorism. Jewish settlers in the West Bank have targeted Palestinians and the Israeli government, demanding the building of more settlements. Cristina, I'm just wondering if the roles were reversed. If it had been a Jewish Israeli baby that had been killed by Palestinians, it would have been just the impetus for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to launch a new war against Palestinians, right?
Right, maybe. I mean, at least we know that there would be some sort of violent reaction, definitely. I think we need to get some insight into the roots of such violence. So, for instance, many Palestinians themselves have spoken to the fact that the Israel government has, in fact, enabled and incited violence in the occupied territories. And so it is actually the Israeli government that often terrorizes Palestinians on a daily basis. So we shouldn't be surprised to see that violence is being carried out by some Jewish extremists. But, again, this violence in many ways is rooted in the state. So I think we always have to bring it back to that issue as well.
Here in the United States, environmental activists in Portland, Oregon have ended their 2-day protest against a Shell icebreaker ship called the Fennica. The ship was held up for 2 days after several people blocked it from leaving the port. Some activists hung from a bridge while others were in kayaks on the water attempting to block it. The Fennica is headed to the Arctic to break up ice in the Chukchi Sea that the activists are worried will destroy a fragile natural environment and fuel climate change. The groups involved were from the Portland Area Climate Action Coalition, including 350 PDX, Portland Rising Tide, and the Sustainable Energy and Economy Network, and they were supported by Greenpeace. The ship has now been able to leave the port. Cristina, how important is this type of activism? It's intended to stop drilling in the Arctic. Can it send a strong enough message to Washington, D.C. to not approve permits to drill?
Well, it's definitely important that it sends a message to the public and political figures. But will it stop Washington from approving the drill? I'm not so sure. I mean, I think if that was the case, we would be seeing a lot less drilling now in the United States itself. And so I think this is a topic, obviously, that people have been concerned about for years. I mean, documentaries like Gasland and Crude and many others, there are countless others that have done the same, exposed multinational corporations' exploitation of the earth. Unfortunately, protesting isn't enough, right? But it still is important to continue that conversation. And that's what these activists are definitely doing. And, again, we have to be reminded of the fact that Washington is bought by the corporations, and so it's going to merely act in those interests.
And finally, supporters of Bernie Sanders' presidential candidacy packed into thousands of homes this week at house parties to hear a simulcast of his message. Senator Sanders spoke from a home in Washington, D.C. His remarks were broadcast into 3,500 homes, bars, coffee shops, and more across the nation, at which 100,000 people were estimated to have attended. During his address, he continued to focus on income inequality, saying, quote, "The American people in our great country believe that our government should belong to all of us and not, as is currently the case, to a handful of billionaires." Sanders also mentioned Sandra Bland, the African-American woman who died in police custody in Texas and whose death has angered the public. He said, quote, "People should not die because they did not put a signal on making a right turn." The event broke records for presidential event turnouts. Now, Cristina, whether or not one supports Sanders, the question is, can he break the deadlock of money in American politics through sheer grassroots campaigning like this?
Well, I think it's something that we'll have to see. I know in some ways, I think about President Obama's achieving unprecedented goals when raising money during his presidential campaign, and also getting a lot of young people to become part of the campaign as well. And so I think, people also called his election a grassroots one. But now I think when we look back on it, I think we would say it was actually probably not one. So that might be an area where we can actually learn from President Obama's campaign. But I think we should also remember, let's not get too excited yet. And I say that precisely because of the presidential election of Obama. And so Sanders' campaign might be providing us with this refreshingly new look at politics, especially in comparison to Hillary Clinton. But again, we did say the same thing in 2008. And so maybe the difference here, though, is that Sanders has actually used phrases like institutionalized racism. But remember, white privilege affords him that option.
Good point. Thank you, as always, Cristina, for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
Cristina Mislan is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism and our daily Newsflash guest expert on Fridays. This is Uprising. We'll be right back after this break.